Imagine a family stepping into what they believed was the perfect life, only to find themselves trapped inside a neighborhood where every smile hides a threat and every rule is a weapon. Imagine a dream home becoming a prison, where the very people sworn to maintain peace are the ones plotting destruction. This is the chilling beginning of Daniel Carter's journey, a story growing more viral with every twist, filled with suspense, secrets, and the kind of danger that makes your heart race. What should have been a peaceful new chapter turns into a nightmare no one could have predicted. Daniel Carter was no ordinary man. He was a retired Delta Force commander, a soldier who had spent decades leading men into the most dangerous corners of the world. He had survived ambushes, carried wounded brothers out of fire, and faced enemies who never played by the rules. But all he wanted now was peace. After hanging up his uniform, Daniel promised his wife Maya and their teenage daughter Lily a new beginning, a safe life far away from war zones. Willow Creek, with its quiet cul-de-sac and perfect houses, looked like the place where that promise could finally be fulfilled. The first week in their new home felt like a dream. Maya adored the sunlight that poured into the kitchen every morning, filling the room with warmth. Lily raced across the backyard, laughing, already planning where to plant their favorite flowers. Daniel stood by the window at night, watching the streetlights glow over the neat row of houses, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was the peace he had been fighting for all along. Yet, despite the calm, his instincts whispered unease. Years of training had sharpened him to sense danger before it struck, and though nothing had happened yet, he noticed the neighbors' smiles tightened when he passed. The way conversations halted until he was gone. On the fourth morning, Daniel found a white envelope neatly folded on the porch. At first, he thought it was a welcome note. Instead, it was a warning. The letter, stamped with the official seal of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, accused him of leaving his trash can on the curb too long and demanded a fine. Daniel chuckled softly, tossing it aside. Strict rules, he told Maya. Nothing to worry about. But in his gut, he felt something colder. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This time, it accused Maya of parking in a restricted area. Daniel frowned. Her car had been in their driveway, their own property. He tucked the letter into a drawer, irritation growing heavier with each word he read. The third letter came on a rainy afternoon. It accused Lily of violating noise rules by playing her piano during the day. The absurdity of the charge left Maya speechless. Lily's eyes filled with tears as she clutched her sheet music, whispering, "I wasn't even being loud, Dad." Daniel's jaw tightened, the soldier inside him stirring awake. These were not harmless mistakes. Someone wanted to break them down, piece by piece. That night, Daniel sat alone in the living room, the notices scattered across the table. The house was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, remembering how many times his instincts had saved his life in combat. Those same instincts now screamed at him. This wasn't about trash, parking, or noise. This was something organized, something personal. The next morning, while walking Lily to the bus stop, an elderly man sitting on his porch called out. His voice was low, almost trembling. "You should be careful, son. They don't want you here." Before Daniel could ask who they were, the man quickly glanced around, fear in his eyes, and shut the door. Daniel stood there, stunned, one hand gripping Lily's backpack as she stepped onto the bus. His eyes scanned the neighborhood. The polished gardens, the crisp white fences, the calm houses where curtains twitched as if someone was always watching. On the surface, Willow Creek was a picture of perfection, but Daniel knew better than to believe in appearances. He had seen villages that looked peaceful one second and exploded with violence the next. The question wasn't if something was wrong, it was how deep the rot went. That evening, Maya found Daniel at the dining table, staring at the letters with the same hard expression she had seen before missions overseas. His voice was steady, but carried a weight she couldn't ignore. "It's starting," he said. "This isn't about rules. This is about us." Maya's breath caught. Lily's hands trembled as she asked, "But why us, Dad? We didn't do anything wrong." Daniel's gaze darkened. He didn't have an answer yet, but his instincts told him the truth was far worse than anything they could imagine. The HOA wasn't just about rules. It was about power, control, and something buried deep in the soil of Willow Creek. And though Daniel Carter had walked away from the battlefield years ago, he realized with a sinking heart that the real war had just followed him home. Daniel Carter tried to shake off the weight of the warnings, but the unease refused to leave him. He had faced warlords and insurgents, but something about Willow Creek felt worse. An enemy that wore a smile in daylight, but sharpened knives in the dark. He woke up each morning scanning his surroundings the way he had once done in hostile territory, every noise outside making his instincts tighten. Maya noticed it too. "You're not sleeping," she whispered one night as they lay in bed. He turned to her and said quietly, "I don't think this neighborhood is what it seems." The harassment didn't stop. It escalated. One evening, Maya walked to the car after grocery shopping and found all 4 tires slashed. Lily's school sent a letter home accusing her of bullying another student, though Lily's teacher privately admitted there was no record of any such behavior. Then came the pounding at the door. 2 local police officers stood on their porch late at night, claiming there had been a noise complaint against them. Daniel kept his composure, but recognized the smirk on one officer's face. It was the same cold grin Sergeant Paul Granger had worn when he introduced himself as the HOA's head of security. Granger wasn't just any man. He was a former cop with a reputation for brutality. Daniel had seen men like him before, men who abused power in the shadows. Maya grew more nervous each day. She hated the way the neighbors stared, how blinds twitched whenever she stepped outside. She clutched Daniel's hand one evening and said, "I don't feel safe here. It's like the whole town is against us." Daniel wrapped an arm around her, but inside, he knew she was right. The turning point came when Lily returned from school in tears. Someone had followed her home. She described a black SUV creeping slowly behind her until she reached neither the neighborhood, only speeding away when she ran inside. Daniel's blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was intimidation. His soldier's instincts screamed that his family was being tested, pushed into fear, and if he didn't act, it would only get worse. Determined to find answers, Daniel started digging into Willow Creek's history. Late nights were spent combing through county records and old newspaper clippings. He discovered that the neighborhood was only 50 years old, built on land that had been abruptly seized in the 1960s, but the official records were vague. Property transfers were signed by men who had since died, and mentions of what the land had once been were conveniently missing. It was as if someone had wiped the past clean. That was when he turned to Mrs. Robinson, the elderly neighbor who had lived in Willow Creek long before the HOA existed. Mrs. Robinson welcomed Daniel into her home, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she admitted. From an old wooden box, she pulled out faded black and white photographs, images of a small black church that once stood exactly where Daniel's house now stood. "It was burned down in '63, she said softly. "People were killed, but no one talked about it. Officials called it an accident, but we all knew better." Daniel studied the photographs, his stomach tightening. The smiling faces of families standing proudly in front of the church haunted him. Mrs. Robinson continued, her voice breaking. "The land was stolen, taken over by men who became the first HOA leaders. Their children and grandchildren still run things here. They don't want anyone asking questions. That's why they're after you." When Daniel left her home, the photographs burned in his mind. Now the harassment made sense. It wasn't about trash cans or parking. It was about burying the truth of a crime that had been hidden for decades. By moving onto that land, his family had stepped directly into the middle of a secret the town had spent generations protecting. But the HOA wasn't done tightening its grip. The very next week, Daniel was accused of assault on Anea Gaburur. Police came with paperwork claiming there was an eyewitness, even though Daniel had been at work all day. Maya was accused of shoplifting at a local store despite the store manager later admitting no theft had been recorded. It was clear. Someone was planting false charges, systematically trying to break them down. Daniel confided in Jorge, a loyal friend and fellow veteran he trusted more than anyone. Jorge listened carefully, his jaw tightening as Daniel laid out everything, the warnings, the sabotage, the history Mrs. Robinson revealed. "You're in a war, brother," Jorge said grimly. "Different battlefield, same rules. They're trying to isolate you, wear you down, and strike when you're weakest." Daniel knew Jorge was right. But this time, he wasn't fighting for a mission or his men. He was fighting for his wife and daughter. He couldn't afford to fail. He reached out to Clarissa Moore, a civil rights lawyer known for exposing corruption in small towns. She listened as Daniel explained everything, her eyes narrowing with determination. "If what you're saying is true," she said, "this goes beyond the HOA. This is a conspiracy that's been buried for decades, and if we can prove it, they'll try to destroy you before the truth comes out." That night, Daniel looked at Maya and Lily as they sat at the dinner table, trying to smile despite the fear hanging in the air. He clenched his fists and swore silently to himself. He had fought to protect strangers in foreign lands. Now, in the heart of his own country, he would fight again. Only this time, the enemy wasn't on a battlefield. The enemy was hiding behind neighborhood fences, police badges, and HOA letters. Daniel Carter, retired Delta Force commander, had been forced into a war he didn't choose. But he knew one thing: he would not lose. The weeks that followed pushed the Carter family deeper into the nightmare. What had started as strange warnings and petty fines had now grown into a storm of intimidation. Daniel Carter, retired Delta Force commander, had been trained to see patterns in chaos, and here the pattern was clear. This wasn't random harassment. It was a campaign designed to force them out, and it was escalating fast. It began with the house itself. One morning, Daniel stepped outside to find their front door smeared with red paint. Across the driveway, someone had spray-painted the words, "Get out." Maya gasped when she saw it, clutching Lily's hand, who buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Daniel's jaw hardened. He crouched, touching the paint with his finger, and felt the familiar surge of anger that came before battle. This was no prank. This was a message. That evening, Maya's car was vandalized again, this time with broken windows. Lily came home in tears after a group of kids cornered her at school, mocking her and whispering threats they claimed came from their parents. The isolation was suffocating. Neighbors who had once smiled politely now turned their backs. Even the mailman avoided eye contact as he dropped envelopes into the box. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been recruited into a silent war. Daniel decided he could no longer sit quietly. He confronted Sergeant Paul Granger, the HOA's head of security, in broad daylight. Granger was leaning against his black SUV at the community park, his uniform jacket draped over his shoulder, his grin smug. "You've had your fun," Daniel said evenly, though his voice carried the sharpness of command. "Touch my family again, and you'll regret it." Granger chuckled, leaning in close enough that Daniel could smell the bitterness of his breath. "This isn't the battlefield, soldier," he sneered. "Here, we make the rules. Maybe the neighborhood isn't the right place for you, or your family." Daniel held his ground, his eyes locked on Granger's. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't have to. The tension between them was enough to draw curious stares from nearby residents, who quickly pretended not to see. Granger finally stepped back, but the smirk on his face promised more trouble. That night, Daniel paced the living room, restless. Maya sat at the table, her hands trembling as she flipped through the growing stack of HOA notices and bogus police reports. "They're not going to stop," she whispered. "They'll keep pushing until they break us." "They won't break us," Daniel replied firmly. But inside, he knew Maya was right. The harassment was designed to escalate until they made a mistake, until fear forced them to leave. He had seen this tactic before, in villages overseas, where oppressors used fear to drive people from their homes. It was a strategy, and he knew strategies could be dismantled. The turning point came when Mrs. Robinson showed up at their door late one evening. Her frail hands clutched another photograph, one she had hidden away for years. This one showed uniformed men, police officers from the 1960s, standing in front of the burned remains of the church. And there, among them, were familiar faces, the fathers and grandfathers of the very men now running the HOA. "They never wanted the truth out," Mrs. Robinson said, her voice shaking, "and they'll do anything to protect it. You're in danger, Daniel, real danger." Her words proved true sooner than anyone expected. 2 nights later, as Daniel drove home from picking up Lily from her friend's house, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. A black SUV trailed them closely, weaving dangerously close to their bumper. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. His instincts kicked in, evasive maneuvers, checking side streets, measuring the driver's aggression. "Dad?" Lily's voice trembled. "Seatbelt tight," he ordered calmly, though his pulse thundered. The SUV suddenly sped up, attempting to ram them. Daniel swerved, his military training turning the chase into a calculated dance. He cut sharply through back roads until he lost them near the edge of town, finally pulling over to catch his breath. Lily sobbed softly, clinging to his arm. Daniel stroked her hair and whispered, "I've got you. They'll never touch you." When they arrived home, Maya was waiting anxiously at the door. Daniel pulled her into his arms, his voice low but unshakable. "It's not just harassment anymore. It's war." From that moment, Daniel shifted into combat mode. He installed security cameras around the house, reinforced the doors, and began keeping watch through the night. Jorge visited often, helping him map out the neighborhood, identifying possible escape routes and blind spots. Clarissa, the lawyer, warned him that legal action would take time, but Daniel knew time was exactly what they didn't have. The Carter family's days became a fragile balance of pretending to live normally while preparing for the next strike. Every sound outside, every unexpected knock at the door, sent tension rippling through the house. Daniel felt the pressure mounting, but he also felt his resolve harden. He had survived war zones across the world. Now he would survive this, but Willow Creek wasn't finished with him yet. One night, as Daniel reviewed the security footage, he saw something that froze his blood. A figure stood at the edge of their yard, staring directly into the camera. The man wore a hood, but when he stepped forward into the light, Daniel recognized him instantly. It was Granger, his expression calm, almost mocking, as if daring Daniel to make the first move. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, his fists tightening. The enemy was no longer hiding in shadows. They were coming straight for his family, and Daniel Carter, Delta Force commander, was ready to fight back. The night Daniel saw Sergeant Granger staring into the camera, he knew the line had been crossed. This was no longer intimidation. It was a declaration of war. Granger wasn't hiding his involvement anymore. He wanted Daniel to know exactly who was pulling the strings. Daniel spent hours replaying the footage, studying every frame the way he once studied enemy surveillance overseas. Granger stood in the yard for over 5 minutes, unmoving, his hands folded behind his back like a soldier mocking his command. At one point, he even saluted the camera before walking away into the shadows. Daniel's blood boiled, but beneath the anger, he felt something colder, calculation. Granger was taunting him, but he was also sending a message. We're watching and you can't stop us. The next day, Clarissa Moore came by with updates on the case. She carried folders thick with documents, photographs, and old reports she had dug out of county archives. Sitting around the Carter dining table, she spread them out carefully. Your instincts were right, Daniel, she said. This neighborhood was built on stolen land. The church that once stood here wasn't destroyed by accident. It was arson. And not just any arson, it was sanctioned. Maya's eyes widened. Sanctioned by who? Clarissa leaned forward, her voice low. Local police, city officials, even the county judge at the time. The fire was covered up as an electrical accident, but eyewitness accounts, including Mrs. Robinson's, say otherwise. Families who lived here were forced out. Some disappeared. Lily, listening silently from the corner, whispered, Disappeared? You mean killed? Clarissa hesitated, then nodded gravely. It's possible. And the men who orchestrated it passed their control down to their children. The same families now control the HOA. This isn't just about enforcing neighborhood rules. It's about protecting a legacy built on blood and lies. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms folded. The truth sank heavily in his chest. He had fought enemies overseas for less, but here, in his own country, entire families had built their power on the ashes of a church. Clarissa continued, her voice urgent. The problem is evidence. Most of the records have been destroyed, and the town's officials are complicit. Without hard proof, they'll keep dismissing everything Asramer. We need something undeniable. It was then that Mrs. Robinson revealed her most guarded secret. She shuffled into the room, clutching a small tin box she had dug out from her attic. Inside were not just photographs, but letters. Correspondence between the former police chief and city council members, casually discussing removing obstacles from the land. The dates matched the week of the fire. Daniel turned the brittle paper over in his hands, his jaw tightening. This was proof, but it was also a target. If the HOA discovered Mrs. Robinson still had this, her life would be in danger. That very night, Daniel's fears proved correct. Around midnight, the sound of glass shattering jolted the family awake. Daniel grabbed the baseball bat he kept near the bed and rushed downstairs. The living room window had been smashed, and a brick lay on the carpet. Attached to it was a note scrawled in jagged handwriting. Last chance, leave. Maya clutched Lily tightly as Daniel scanned the yard, but whoever had thrown the brick was already gone. He could feel Granger's smirk in the darkness. The next morning, Jorge came over to inspect the damage. They're testing you, he said grimly, trying to see if you'll run. But if they know about those letters, they won't just stop at threats. Daniel nodded. That's why we need to move fast. If we expose the truth before they silence us, we stand a chance. Together with Clarissa, they devised a plan. Gather everything, photos, letters, testimony, and prepare to make it public in one undeniable release. But even as they planned, Daniel sensed danger closing in. Granger wouldn't let them get that far. Sure enough, the harassment grew more brazen. Police cars began parking outside their house at odd hours, their lights flashing as if to mark the Carters as criminals. HOA members circulate rumors that Daniel was violent, Maya was unfaithful, and Lily was a troublemaker. The community turned colder than ever, with neighbors whispering as the family walked past. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was character assassination. Then the trap was sprung. One evening, Maya didn't come home. She had gone to pick up groceries, but hours passed, and she never returned. Daniel's calls went unanswered. Panic surged through his veins, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his worst days in combat. He called Jorge immediately, and within minutes, as they were tracing Maya's usual route. Her car was found abandoned on a quiet street, driver's door open, groceries spilt across the ground. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't random. This was abduction. In that moment, the soldier in him fully reawakened. His family was under direct attack, and now it wasn't just about harassment or history. It was about survival. He turned to Jorge, his voice cold and steady. "They've made their move. Now it's our turn." Daniel Carter had been pushed to the edge, but this time, the HOA and their corrupt allies had gone too far. They had crossed the one line he would never forgive, taking his wife. And for that, Daniel was ready to bring the war to their doorstep. Daniel stood in the empty street staring at the abandoned car, his pulse pounding with fury. The groceries lay scattered like a breadcrumb trail of violence, each can and bag of fruit reminding him how ordinary this evening should have been. But nothing about this was ordinary anymore. This was war, and the HOA, with Sergeant Granger at its core, had just escalated it to a level Daniel could never forgive. He crouched low, scanning the scene like the Delta Force commander he once was. Tire tracks curved away from the curb, sharp and hurried, suggesting Maya had been taken fast. Daniel ran his hand across the pavement, his instincts piecing together the story. There had been at least 2 men, maybe 3. They had boxed her in her car, forced her out, and dragged her away. Jorge hovered close behind, gripping a crowbar he'd snatched from his truck. "We need to call the police," Jorge said, though his voice lacked conviction. Daniel shook his head, his jaw hard. "The police are the problem. Granger runs them. If we call, all we'll do is warn them that we know she's missing. They'll bury her faster." Clarissa, who had rushed to meet them, looked pale under the streetlight. "Then what do? We don't even know where they've taken her." Daniel stood, eyes narrowing into the darkness. "We don't have to know. We make them show us." Back at his house, Daniel opened a locked trunk he hadn't touched in years. Inside were remnants of his military past. Tactical gear, a headset, an old combat knife, and maps he once used to train recruits. He spread the maps across the dining table, circling properties around the neighborhood that were isolated, abandoned, or owned by the HOA. "They won't risk taking her far," Daniel explained. "Too much attention. They'll keep her close, somewhere they control." Mrs. Robinson, watching from the corner, whispered, "There's an old maintenance shed near the woods. It used to belong to the church before the fire. Nobody goes there anymore." Daniel's eyes locked on the spot she pointed out. "That's it. That's where they'll keep her." Jorge slapped the crowbar against his palm, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "Then we're going in tonight?" Daniel met his friend's eyes and nodded. "But we go smart. We can't afford mistakes. Maya's life depends on it." By midnight, the rescue operation was in motion. Daniel and Jorge crept through the woods, their footsteps muffled by leaves. The moonlight filtered weakly through the branches, casting eerie shadows that played tricks on the eyes. From a distance, Daniel spotted a faint glow, a lantern inside the shed. 2 men stood outside, smoking, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Daniel's military instincts kicked in fully. Hesigna led Jorge to circle left while he advanced low and silent. He remembered every drill, every raid, every night mission where a single sound could cost lives. This was no different, except now the hostage was his wife. In one swift motion, Daniel struck. He launched from the shadows, disarming the first guard with a bone-cracking twist of his wrist before the man could cry out. Jorge swung the crowbar into the second man's ribs, sending him sprawling with a groan. Both were down, but Daniel didn't linger. He pushed through the shed door. Inside, the air reeked of mildew and gasoline. Maya sat bound to a chair, her eyes wide with fear but alive. Relief washed over Daniel, but he didn't let it slow him down. He knelt, cutting through the ropes. "Daniel," she gasped, tears spilling. "They said they'd kill me if you didn't leave town." "They know about the letters." Daniel's voice was steady, calm, despite the storm inside him. "You're safe now. We're going home." But before they could move, heavy footsteps pounded outside. A voice barked, a voice Daniel knew too well. "Sergeant Granger, you think you can just waltz in here, Carter? You think this is your battlefield? This is my town." Daniel's grip tightened on the knife. He motioned Jorge to guard Maya, then stepped into the doorway. Granger stood with 3 more officers, their guns drawn, faces hardened with the arrogance of men who thought themselves untouchable. Daniel didn't flinch. "You've already lost, Granger." "The truth is out and your time is up," Granger sneered. "Truth doesn't matter when you control the story. By morning, you'll be the criminal who attacked law enforcement. And your family? Gone! Forgotten!" The standoff crackled with tension, the silence heavier than gunfire. Then, in a split-second decision, Daniel struck. He tossed a flashbang, a relic from his Delta days he had never thought he'd use again. The explosion of light and sound disoriented the officers, sending them stumbling. Daniel moved with lethal precision, disarming one, knocking another unconscious, and leaving Granger face down in the dirt. With Maya safe in Jorge's arms, Daniel pressed his knee into Granger's back, forcing his face into the ground. "This ends tonight," Daniel hissed. Granger spat, struggling. "You don't get it, Carter. We're everywhere. Even if you take me down, the system protects us." But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he bound Granger's wrists with the same rope used on Maya. For once, the predator was the prisoner. They moved quickly, escaping through the woods before reinforcements arrived. Maya clung to Daniel's arm, shaken but alive. Jorge carried the evidence box Mrs. Robinson had entrusted to them with. As dawn broke, Daniel knew this wasn't over. Granger might be in custody, but he was right about one thing. The corruption ran deeper than one man. They had won a battle, but the war for justice was just beginning, and Daniel Carter was ready to fight it to the end. The dawn after Maya's rescue should have brought peace, but for Daniel Carter, it only sharpened the storm. The shed encounter had been a victory, yes, but it was only one head of a many-headed beast. Granger sat bound in the basement of Jorge's garage, gagged and stripped of his badge. Yet Daniel knew keeping him hidden was only temporary. The HOA, the police department, and the officials protecting them would already be scrambling. Their power shaken, but not broken. Maya, still trembling from her ordeal, refused to stay behind. "They'll come after us again, Daniel," she said, her voice raw but steady. "If we don't end this now, they'll never stop." "We have to go public," Clarissa Moore agreed. She laid out the battered box of evidence on Jorge's workbench. Letters between officials, photographs of the church before and after the fire, witness accounts buried for decades. "This is enough to spark an investigation," she explained. "But it won't matter if we just hand it over to local authorities, they'll bury it again. We need the people watching, live, unstoppable." Daniel considered her words carefully. Broadcasting the truth would make them heroes in the eyes of some, but enemies to men who had spent their lives silencing dissent. Once the genie was out of the bottle, there would be no putting it back. That evening, Clarissa made the call. A trusted journalist from a national network agreed to meet at the community center under the cover of night. The plan was risky, too many moving parts, too many chances for betrayal, but it was the only way to shine a light strong enough to burn through the lies. As they prepared, Granger tried to taunt them through his gag, his muffled laughter filling the garage. Daniel leaned close, his eyes like steel. "You should have learned one thing about me, Sergeant," he whispered. "I don't break." Hours later, the small team moved under the cover of darkness. Daniel led Maya, Clarissa, Jorge, and Mrs. Robinson to the abandoned community center, the same place where, decades ago, the black church congregation had once gathered. It was fitting, Daniel thought, that truth would return to the place where injustice had begun. Inside, Clarissa set up a camera while the journalist adjusted her equipment. Mrs. Robinson sat at the front, her hands trembling as she clutched the photographs she had hidden for half a lifetime. "They burned it to the ground," she said softly. "And they thought no one would remember." Daniel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Tonight everyone will remember." The broadcast began. Clarissa spoke with calm authority, presenting the documents and reading aloud the damning letters. Mrs. Robinson gave her testimony, her voice shaking but fierce. Then Daniel stepped into frame, his presence filling the screen. He spoke not just as a soldier, but as a husband, a father, and a man who refused to bow to corruption. "This is not about me," he said, staring into the lens as if addressing the entire nation. "This is about every family who was silenced, every life destroyed because those in power thought they could rewrite history. That ends now. This land is ours. This home is ours. and no one will take it from us again. The feed went live across social media, spreading faster than wildfire. Comments poured in, outrage swelling as viewers across the country saw the evidence for themselves. Hashtags trended within minutes, demanding federal action. But the HOA wasn't going to let them finish unchallenged. As Daniel spoke his final words, headlights flooded the windows. Police cars surrounded the community center, sirens wailing, red and blue lights painting the walls like a warning. Through the glass, Daniel saw dozens of officers with rifles raised, and at their front, an interim chief sent to clean up Granger's mess. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Daniel Carter, you are under arrest. Step outside with your hands up." Maya gripped his arm, fear flickering in her eyes. Jorge cursed under his breath, clutching the crowbar he refused to let go of. Clarissa held tight to the laptop, making sure the feed never cut out. Daniel's mind raced. They couldn't afford to surrender. The evidence would vanish, and their story would be twisted. Yet they couldn't afford a firefight either, not with Maya and Mrs. Robinson in the building. Then, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began arriving. One by one, cars pulled up, and people stepped out, families who had heard the broadcast, drawn by courage stronger than fear. They stood between the police and the community center, their voices rising in chants. "Justice for the church! Justice for the Carters!" The officers hesitated, the weight of cameras and witnesses pressing against their authority. For the first time, the system's armor cracked. Daniel stepped outside, holding the letters high. "The whole world is watching," he called. "Make your choice. Stand with corruption or stand with truth." The moment stretched, tense and fragile. Then, from behind the police line, a federal vehicle rolled in. Men in dark suits stepped out, flashing badges that outshone the local sheriff's authority. FBI. The interim chief paled as agents brushed past him, seizing boxes of evidence and taking Granger into custody. The crowd erupted in cheers, the pressure breaking like a storm giving way to sunlight. Inside, Maya sank into Daniel's arms, relief and pride flooding her. "You did it," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "We did it. All of us." But even as the moment burned bright, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The arrest would shake the city, but healing decades of buried pain would take far longer. Tonight was victory, but tomorrow, the real fight for justice and reconciliation would begin. The roar of the crowd outside the community center echoed in Daniel Carter's ears long after the federal agents had taken Sergeant Granger away. For the first time since moving into Crestwood Hills, the Carters were not alone. Neighbors, strangers, even people from nearby towns stood united, their voices rising louder than the corruption that had silenced them for decades. Inside, Clarissa slumped into a chair, her exhaustion plain but her eyes burning with victory. Mrs. Robinson wept quietly, clutching the faded photograph she had protected for so long. Jorge clapped Daniel on the back, his voice rough with emotion. "You did what none of us thought possible. You brought the truth into the light." Daniel glanced at Maya and Lily. His wife's face bore the scars of fear and endurance, yet her eyes shone with unshakable strength. His daughter clung to her mother, finally able to smile. For Daniel, their safety was the only victory that truly mattered. Still, he knew the storm wasn't fully over. In the days that followed, the city of Crestwood Hills became the focus of national attention. News vans lined the streets, reporters clamored for interviews, and federal investigators swarmed City Hall, the police department, and the homes of officials who had once thought themselves untouchable. Decades of secrets spilt into the open, exposing a network of theft, cover-ups, and racial terror buried beneath manicured lawns and white fences. The arrests came swiftly. Councilmen, former sheriffs, and even sitting judges were led away in handcuffs. The HOA dissolved under federal order, its leaders facing charges ranging from conspiracy to kidnapping. The burned church site was officially declared a memorial, its history recorded and preserved rather than erased. For the community, it was a reckoning. Some families left, unable to face the shame tied to their names. Others stayed, determined to rebuild trust on the foundations of honesty rather than lies. At the center of it all stood the Carters, unwilling heroes who had simply wanted a home but found themselves carrying the weight of an entire city's conscience. One evening, weeks after the arrests, Daniel walked the grounds where the church had once stood. Fresh flowers lay against a new marker that told the true story of the fire, of the lives lost, of the injustice hidden for so long. Beside him, Mrs. Robinson held his arm for balance. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she whispered, her voice quivering. All those years I kept the truth locked away, praying someone would care enough to fight for it. You cared, Daniel. You gave these people back their voices. Daniel looked at her gently. It wasn't just me. You were the keeper of the truth. We only carried it forward. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Maya joined them, her hand slipping into Daniel's. For the first time in months, there was peace in her eyes. We're finally home, she said softly. That night, the Carters invited their neighbors, old and new, to their backyard for a gathering. The mood was light, filled with laughter, the smell of food, and the sound of children running across the grass. Jorge raised a glass in Daniel's honor, but Daniel only smiled, shaking his head. This isn't about me, he said to the small crowd. It's about us. It's about choosing courage over silence, truth over comfort. If we want Crestwood Hills to mean something more than the lies it was built on, then it's up to us to build it together. Applause followed, warm and genuine. For once, the neighborhood felt like the home it was meant to be. Later, as the guests left and the night quieted, Daniel sat on the porch with Maya. Lily slept soundly inside, safe at last. The cicadas hummed in the distance, their song a steady rhythm against the backdrop of peace. Maya leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. Not walking away when we had the chance? Daniel shook his head, his gaze steady on the dark horizon. I fought battles across the world, but none of them mattered as much as this one. This wasn't about winning a war. It was about saving our family, saving this community. And if standing our ground means Lily grows up in a place where truth matters, then no. I don't regret a single step. Silence settled comfortably between them, heavy not with fear but with contentment. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of months of struggle finally lifting. He knew scars would remain, on the land, on the people, even on his family, but scars were proof of survival. As the first stars blinked above, Daniel Carter made peace with his new life. He was no longer just the retired Delta Force commander haunted by old battles. He was a husband, a father, and now a guardian of truth in a place that once thrived on lies. The fight was over. The darkness had been dragged into the light. And for the Carters, Crestwood Hills was no longer a battleground. It was finally, truly, home.